Okay, let's read a little more Kundalini book. We are in The Shock of Awakening. Okay, beginning on page 90, Jana Dixon, we're just discussing. Here we go. The sudden forced arousal to activity of this hitherto inactive center creates a condition analogous to that created by a serious accident. That's a quote from Living with Kundalini by Gopi Krishna. Spiritual awakening is damned inconvenient at the best of times. The awakening of Kundalini appears to be a major autonomic shock to the whole organism. The shock, panic, anxiety, and depression can occur regardless of the condition in one's life or the personal contents of one's mind, and despite whatever story or explanation we give ourselves as to what is happening to us. This is probably due to the penetration of the veil of conditioning and its repression mechanisms, along with hyperactivation of the adrenal glands and massive changes in the nervous system. The first awakening appears to be more of a neoteric shock to the system than subsequent awakenings, even if subsequent awakenings are more intense. She says, in my first awakening when I was 28 years old, I lost 30 pounds in nervous energy and my periods ceased for 6 months. The autonomic shock could also be an expression and felt sense of the unconsciousness and organic blockages that are becoming apparent with the amplification of energy and consciousness. That is, the ego becomes aware that it was only masquerading and it was not ourself, by the self's sudden appearance and the collapse of our known self and worldview. So this disillusionment can create an intractable, ineffable shock and depression in the beginning stages of the awakening. The ego mind can't really make sense of the shock, for it happens well below conscious awareness and is unrelated to the daily world, but is simply a phase of the metamorphic process. So this shock is happening because the ego just got its whole worldview shaken and it is having to cope. So we can't really pin it to our day-to-day, but it's happening nonetheless. The personality has to learn to adjust to being stuck in the middle of an uproar of our physiology and an inflation of our psychic super senses. So she now quotes, in Kundalini Energy and Christian Spirituality by Philip St. Romain, he relates his ideas on the changes in the autonomic nervous system. And then she gives points. First one is, the sympathetic nerves constrict blood vessels in the skin and most viscera. This leads to an increase in heart rate and faster breathing, both of which are observed during meditation. It may also explain the heat experienced on the skin, particularly the shoulders. One is reminded here of yogis drying cold, wet sheets with their shoulders. Okay, the second one is the sympathetic nerves dilate blood vessels in the skeletal muscles. This allows more blood to be taken to the skeletal muscles. Presumably, this once served as an adaptive role in running from danger, so why they would go to muscular skeletal muscles. During Kundalini, it serves to carry more nutrients to muscle tissues being healed from emotional pain. The third point she quotes, sympathetic nerves stimulate glycogenolysis, which increases blood sugar. This serves to keep the body energized in the state of heightened nervous activity. The Hindus' concern for proper diet may also be related to this effect. So that blood sugar increase, so why they would do a very bland or sattvic diet is what she's saying, or what Philip St. Romain is saying. And then the fourth thing she quotes from this text is, sympathetic nerves stimulate adrenaline secretion, which elevates heat rate and brings the body into a higher state of preparedness. This is also an undeniable effect of meditation, which paradoxically results in an eventual lowering of the threshold of excitability. Consequently, meditators do not become stressed easily. So then she goes back to saying, after the first major opening of the influx, which she called sex with Eros, I experienced a corresponding major contraction. I call this particular contraction the white shock, as we've already said, because blood leaves the skin's surface and the skin turns white. During this event, you feel rather like a robot, for motor control is diminished and you are dispossessed. That is, you go into an unavoidable shock. During the white shock, with the meta-activation of the sympathetic nervous and adrenals are highly active, and the blood moves away from the body's surface and is sent to the skeletal muscles. Perhaps this is tied into the changes in the production of immune cells in the bone marrow during metamorphosis. At this time, the nervous system would be flooding the body with a certain mix of neuropeptides that would signal the cells to change from their normal function to transmutation mode. Okay, so the immune system is flooding, you got new information, like we're changing, we need a new function. The fact that the neuropeptides are the molecules of emotion and that this alchemy occurs of its own accord and there is not much we can do about it helps explain why the early stages of a sudden awakening can be so emotionally overwhelming. The initiation of metamorphic chemistry activates the adrenal and sympathetic nervous system, which is essentially your fight or flight system. So great, this sympathetic activation during the initiation influx stage that the digestive system purges. So great is it that the digestive system purges, so you have to get stuff out of your body. Digestion is activated by parasympathetic, or the rest relaxation side of the nervous system, and with the crisis instigated by the radical sympathetic activation, the body rapidly purges the intestinal tract so that more energy can be available for strategic thinking for this perceived fight or flight. So this purging is essential so that when the white shock phase hits the digestive system, it's relatively empty, right? For the intestines and the visceral organs to go into an intense contraction. So your body doesn't want anything left in there before it goes into this. Perhaps this contraction is necessary in order to reset the functions of the organs into a transmutation mode. Note that while the body is purging, it is best to avoid eating food. Instead, a little fresh fruit or fresh squeezed vegetable juice should be fine, but only if you are desiring it. So during the white shock of 2000 awakening, the autonomic shock my body went into of its own accord was perhaps equivalent to seeing a nuclear blast occur out of the blue. Most people would assume in experiencing this kind of autonomic shock that they are going through a dark night of the soul experience. She says for her, the white shock proper occurred after the initial peak opening of the influx of spirit, the shock being in direct proportion to the extent of the opening. The white shock is associated with the ignition phase, while the die-off happens after a certain time interval of that transmutation has occurred. The die-offs are quite different in sensation and physiology to the white shock experience. The white shock is a state of septic shock created by the nitric oxide, free radicals, and other metabolites produced during the hyperactivation of the initiation. While the die-off is an elaborate catabolic process choreographed by hormones, etc., and involving the immune cells cannibalizing body cells that cannot withstand the high oxidation conditions, this die-off phenomenon is known in the spiritual traditions as the death and resurrection, because that's literally what's happening to your cells. To deal with the septic shock, do gentle stretching and pushing exercises and plenty of breathing. Get some form of body work or the comfort of another human body to hug. Eat green vegetables and green drinks and avoid heavy foods, for a body in shock is not prepared to digest foods. Okay, supplement at least with B vitamins, that's your stress vitamins, and antioxidants, and drink plenty of good filtered water. Take frequent long baths in Epsom salts to provide the magnesium that will help turn on the relaxing parasympathetic system. and loosen the contraction of the intestines, allowing proper peristalsis action. Where Kundalini comes in is that besides enlightened child rearing, it is the one thing that can transform the older regions of the brain and bring the individual body, mind, and soul into a sense of being that is no longer fixed on defending the illusion of self and preventing its own death. This is so because the mask of the conditioned self is slowly burned away in the fires of Kundalini, and a new species is born, a species that is at peace with its own death, because it dies every second in its own fire of ecstasy, right? A species that is at peace with its awesome sensitivity and vulnerability, because it's no longer running from these, but opening to them to discover our true power is in our depths. Kundalini provides a disruption and a penetration of consensus reality and its repressive mechanisms. The chemistry of awakening, with its vividness, bliss, and grace, provides us with the spiritual resources to feel into our deadness, shutdowns, and resistance. In this way, presence incarnates and fills in our removal from existence, making us fully whole and here. And she puts in parentheses, healed. In order to develop the post-conventional mind with which to investigate and use Kundalini effectively, we have to be actively transmuting via Kundalini itself. Through Gnostic recognition of innate order of the universe, we overcome the disharmony, dysfunction, and entropy in the human condition. The brightening of the human soul and the overhaul of the physical body frees us from the conditioning of the past and are thus able to develop a post-conventional mind. To simply engage the full spectrum of the consciousness that is available to us, to live our genius. The bliss of Kundalini is the grace, but then the work involves the will to let go of the past habitual self. The work is to put love juice consciousness into blockages to transform them, but also through faith to treat the blockages as if they were not even there. Communal love and pure friendship acts to stabilize higher states into structures. Higher structures of consciousness are discovered only via a leap of faith into the dark with no knowledge of where we might land. Kundalini represents a quickening of the metabolism, a dissolving of the past morphogenic habits of form and mind. The reason why it appears that Kundalini burns away karma is that one's self and one's world has become more changeable, more plastic, exceptional, original, real, and unique. With depth, one is simply not a victim of circumstance, but a conscious, co-creative participant in the mystery. The expansion of consciousness that arises as the elixir quickens the blood constitutes a spiritual healing that redeems body, mind, and soul. This redemption involves a cleansing, a healing, a renewal, not only of the life of the individual, but also of the ancestral line and the residual imprint of ancestral karma that is embedded within the individual's psychosomatic makeup. Big deal, this shock of awakening and the power that it has to transform a person. So let's go forward a little bit more. Ego death. Ego is composed of a socialized set of arbitrary boundaries or limitations that altogether define a person's inner identity. These inner boundaries include values, beliefs, and understandings in the sense that people tend to stand under or within these socially enforced self-imposed limitations. That's a quote by John Van Burrell. And now by John Pierakos, he says, The myriad forms of dysfunction all derive from separation between self-awareness and awareness of the whole. A separation that the negative aspect of the ego battles to maintain. So she goes on to say, the ego protects us from full knowledge of the shadow, and to the extent that it does this, it also blocks us off from superconsciousness as well. The ego, or you could say the functional personality, disappears in extreme Kundalini events because of the enormous energy coursing through the hindbrain, sensory motor cortex, and the limbic brain. Normally, excuse me, in extreme fight or flight chemistry, the prefrontal lobes are disengaged in order to allow the more instinctive parts of the brain to deal with danger. But during a spiritual emergency, however, the stimulation to the nervous system is internally generated. Often, the autonomic shock involved in Kundalini awakening is many times greater than that which we'd ever experience in the course of our normal human life. Just as a virgin has only a limited grasp of what a human is prior to having sex, so too, those who have not experienced the ecstatic inner conjunction or a dark night also have a limited perception of the height and depth of the human experience. These extreme events make the ego more sober, respectful, and humble because of this cellular reassessment of what it is to be human. This adjustment is largely biochemical, involving the expulsion of stored tension energy and extensive reconstruction of neural hardware. And it is this chemical, energetic, and experiential reformation which leads to what we know as the ego death. Whereas it really should be known as the expansion of the limited boundaries of the ego to encompass a larger felt sense of what it is to be human. What is ego death? She says ego death represents the neurodetoxification of fossilized repression, removing the friction and futile cycling of the nervous system, allowing a higher pattern to form. Ooh, love it. With higher coherency and integration, the neurotic compartmentalized self is healed or made whole. Our self is composed of the parent superego, the adult ego, the child id in all states. That is waking, dreaming, and deep sleep plus altered states. To this triad, there is both the light and the dark aspects, the eros, pro-life, and thanatos, pro-death, coupled with the unconscious, conscious, superconsciousness. All these factors are interacting to create the subjective experience of our seat of self, lower self, higher self. This is determined by karma of happenstance and our response to it. Once we are capable, once we're able to stabilize our consciousness beyond knee-jerk reactions to the environment, then we are capable of cultivating greater depth and coherency. As we increase our light, that is, increase our energy of consciousness, we embody more of the positive eros qualities, and our conscious bandwidth expands to encompass more of the unconscious and superconsciousness. So ego death in this sense is simply a loss of neurosis via increased integration and coherency, right? So you understand more, your bandwidth is larger. Iliad says on page 291 of Yoga, Immortality, and Freedom that both yoga and alchemy are an experiment of soul, of austerely using the body as a laboratory for purification toward the final transmutation or perfection. Perfection being to decondition life, attain freedom, bliss, the deliverance from laws of time or immortality, i.e. enlightenment. Ego death refers to the death of our resistance to enlightenment. To have mastered life is to realize life as ego death? Is the glorification of the ego not the degradation of it, right? The dissolution of Kundalini lifts the repressed hold of the ego, allowing us to embrace a much wider sense of ourselves. I always say I just give the ego a job now. Like, I understand the ego has a job, and I respect, and the ego can respect that, right, from the higher mind. Kundalini awakenings provide the potential to get real beyond our conditioning and the social models with which we've been sleeping. The dominant rule of the ego over the body and mind and soul is the main problem we face individually and collectively. In alchemical terms, the red king must be boiled down and dissolved in the great womb vessel, regressed as the neurons dissolve themselves, in order for the wounded king to be transformed into the universal or sacred king. This is the basic principle of alchemical treaties referring to the human transmutation. The greater the ego, the harder the fall because of the substantially stronger sense of self. So there's a need for a greater force to perturb that stability in order for the ego death and rebirth to occur. A lesser man would not have to go through such an ordeal because it doesn't take such force to reduce his brain to 0 point. That is, to dissolve it down in the great vessel womb of the void in order to be reshaped. Now, Christina Groff says, ego death does not mean the disintegration of a healthy ego, the ego we need in order to function in daily life, but what dies in this process is the part of us that holds on to the illusion of control, the part of us that thinks that we are running the show, that we are in charge. What disintegrates is the false identity that operates as though we are the center of the universe. The fear of death arises because we've been programmed to believe we are an object rather than a process. That we have to invent mythologies like reincarnation, heaven, hell, and punishment, reward in order to reinforce our beliefs in continuation of the object, right? However, once we truly grok that we are a process and death is a continuation of the life process, then we no longer feel like it lies as a final humiliation of a long gauntlet of humiliations to our rigid self-sense of being as an object. It then becomes like a welcome reward for a life truly lived rather than a death we must constantly avoid. Perhaps the only struggle there is in giving up our survivalist personality and allowing this meltdown to occur, trusting there is a new world on the other side of the known. One of the safety valves to ensure that only the truly awakened get to the full Siddha power is that awakening is an inexorable process of death. Without the sadness and humility of having to edit out one's former self, the new cannot be born. True power, therefore, is in the death of the former self. Thus, the first stages of awakening correspond to the Kubler-Ross stages of grieving. Number 1, denial, this can't be happening. Number 2, anger, why me? Why do I have to do all this work? And number 3, bargaining, just let me keep my pointless job and car and beer or two. Number 4, depression, it's hopeless, why bother with anything? And number 5, finally, acceptance, I know I will be in a better place. After the inner child stops clinging and lets go into the space mind, you pass through the self membrane, smaller self, bigger self membrane, into higher states that lead you into these final 6 phases, which are progressive surrender, falling into sync with the muse and the kairos. Number 7, progressive differentiation, pulling away from the need for social affirmation, so you don't need anyone's approval. Number 8, progressive solidification. So now you're strengthening identity with spirit in action. Number 9, progressive reward, increased bliss, presence, and self-assurance. Number 10, progressive awe and magic, the realization of goals, less obstructions in the way, and finally, progressive unity, which is the not to non-dual realization continuous in daily life. So what a beautiful process. And finally, let's just end. Let's do a little bit more here. We're only at 25 minutes. Existential escapism. The realms of non-dualism, or no self, and EST propose the idea that the central core self is just another limitation on freedom. However, a more advanced way of looking at it is not the negation of self, but the acknowledgement that the self is plastic. Saying that the habitual self is non-existent when all selves and organisms consist of morphogenic habit is silly. It does exist, it's there. But we can proceed if we acknowledge that indeed new habits can be made along with perpetually new self-concept. The wisdom of no excuse lies not in the self doing an ostrich trick of poking its head in the sand to hide from its own existence, but in realizing our limitations are self-fabricated. So by fully owning this self-fabricating, self-metamorphogenic process, we can construct a self-concept that is more adaptable and present to an ever-changing reality. In fact, we must if we are going to truly go through this process and experience a great change. The no self-thought virus is part of the feudal extortion system of religions and cults. Rather than emphasizing that we are a vehicle of spirit, they emphasize that we are no self and so can be enslaved to an external regime. Evolution is always in the direction of autonomy, not slavery and self-sacrifice. Self-sacrifice is a control device of exploitive power structures that rule by fiat. Compassionate distancing or witnessing allows a more pliable morphogenic range of thought, action, and emotion. This allows us the emotional stability to build up energy and self-integrity, that is, to incarnate. Spiritual arrows both informs and informs our being. The self can thus tap into infinite resources through being infinitely pliable and expansive. The self doesn't disappear. It becomes more transparent, more plastic, less rigid. And because of this expansiveness, it flows along seamlessly with happenstance, with less surface tension and less wasteful emotional friction. The answer to the Grail question, who does the Grail serve, is spirit. The more we come to know this question and its answers, the more enlightened we become. I want to point out the obvious, which is often not so obvious within the confusing, multi-layered motivation of human relations. It is only through sovereign realization that we can contribute our most transcendent genius for the well-being of the collective. Spirituality is the realization of the individual, not the sacrifice of the individual to the mediocrity of the collective. It is not through neglecting or avoiding our individuality that we connect with the all, or God, but by fully embodying and expressing our uniqueness. That's the biggest piece of this whole thing. By fully embodying and expressing our uniqueness is how we connect with the all. By default awareness, a sick mechanism of scarcity and fear throughout all aspects of culture tries to impose its will on us in determining who we are and our usefulness to the collective. She, in quote, says Borg. To emerge from the gravity of this ancient unconscious form of control, we need both clarity, stamina, and determination. That's three things. To break free from the clutches of these lower primate dynamics. Only by living our genius in constant connection to the all can we contribute anything of evolutionary transcendent value. Only by living our genius. And thereby be a secret agent of change from the old power war system to the new green peace world. Non-duality is Sahaj Samadhi, or the state of no difference, in which all that arises is recognized as a mere self-existing and self-radiant divine being. Enlightenment is the realization of the perfect transparency of the conditional world to its source. The whole play of existence appears merely as a veil, transparent to the inherent self-light. Adida says the 3 stages of perfect practice entail: number 1, the realization of the witness; number 2, the contemplation of the depth; and number 3, transcendence of the content of consciousness. Yet this is no negation or trivialization of the contents of consciousness, but a distance, a plasticity in relation to content, which allows the realization of the higher energetic, coherent, syntropic win-win outcome. There is the no self, and there is the self with the big S. And the big S self is called to evolutionary action. In this radical move from the personal to the transpersonal, there is a dismantling of the ego, not the glorification of the ego. Spirituality is the realization of the self as one with and not separate from the universal organism. Now, if ego, or separate self-sense, is the tension between the poles of subject and object, it is this pullback into separation. It is this defensive perspective which contracts us from infinity that constitutes our suffering. So in the act of separation, the conditioned reactive self accumulates negative karma. I want to say that again. The act of separation, the conditioned reactive self accumulates negative karma. The act of separation. Finishing with the past means letting go of ego defenses and attachments to that recycled conditioning. This is the key to the entirety of life. Our Rick Redmond says, Garwin says that for every breakthrough, there's a corresponding breakdown of older circuits that, if re-entrained, are at a root cause of potential insanity. Sri Ramana Maharishi said, the Jnani, or the enlightened, continually enjoys uninterrupted transcendental experience, keeping his inner attention always on the source in spite of the apparent existence of the ego, which the ignorant imagines to be real. This apparent ego is harmless. It is like the skeleton of a burnt rope. Though it has form, it is of no use to tie anything with. I'm not sure how I feel. Yeah, the old ego is of no use in that sense. Fabulous article on ego death, Death of Eros, a Buddhist view by David Loy. She gives some references to. And we're going to go ahead and stop there. So we'll come back tomorrow. We'll talk about die-offs. Thank you for joining me. See you next time.